Vector to you may just be a footnote in the story of the supercar. Perhaps you've never heard of it before at all. Either way, I can guarantee you there's few stories crazier than this one in the whole history of the car. So buckle up and enjoy. This is the story of Vector Motors. The story of Vector begins as those of many supercar manufacturers do, with an ambitious young designer. This particular one happened to be American. His name was Gerald "Jerry" Wiegert. Upon graduating from college in 1970, where he had attained a design degree, he worked as a design consultant for Chrysler, Ford and General Motors. After a single year, he decided he'd done enough for the big guys, and in 1971 he co-founded a design house called Vehicle Design Force with Hollywood car body expert Lee Brown. At this point in his life, Wiegert was just 27 years old and had just one single year of industry experience. Nevertheless, he wanted to make his mark, and his mark was to be a homegrown American alternative to Ferrari and Lamborghini. Why should the American ultra-wealthy have to look elsewhere for their wonderful, never at all overcompensatory, roadworthy rocket ships after all? He'd call this ambitious project Vector.
Hey.
No, not that Vector. This planned all-American supercar would see many iterations in the years following. At one point, Wiegert said the car would be powered by a Wankel rotary engine. Check out my video on the Mazda 787B for a breakdown of how it works. Or even a borrowed Porsche engine. He told press it would likely cost around $100,000, which represents around $690,000 today. At the time, a brand new Lamborghini Miura was barely a quarter of this, among other bold claims around its performance and ability. The following year, 1972 for those paying attention, the Vector was featured on the cover of Motor Trend magazine. However, it'd be a while yet before consumers could get to see one in the flesh. Finally, in 1976, the Vector was presented to the world. Or rather, an immobile prototype concept car was presented at the LA Auto Show. I don't know if the display was popular or not, but the vehicle never entered production, so I'll let you fill in the blanks on that one. Lee Brown saw little future for the fledgling business and left the design team at Vehicle Design Force in 1977. Undeterred, Wiegert shifted his focus to the next project, promptly renaming the company to Vector Aeromotive and beginning work on the W2. Before we continue with this story, and I promise you it gets bizarre, I feel like I should address a couple of points. Firstly, the new name. I am aware that it makes no sense at all. While the car's designs were clearly influenced by aircraft, with the later W8 including aircraft touches such as the screen from a fighter jet and an engine hours dial, Aeromotive is perhaps still a stretch. That being said, it does sound cooler than automotive, so in that regard he's got the Italians bang to rights. While we're having this short aside, I'll explain Wiegert's naming scheme to you. W stood for Wiegert, followed by a number. If it has an X in the name, it's a prototype. In 1978, Wiegert had a display prototype of the W2 at the LA Auto Show. People thought it was more of the same and assumed that, like its predecessor, nothing would actually come of it. Man, were they wrong. Ish. A year after unveiling the display model, a running prototype was built, allowing motor journalists behind the wheel of a Vector for the very first time. Throughout its press tour, the car garnered more than 100,000 miles. All was not smooth sailing though. One of the more high-profile outlets to get their hands on a W2 was Top Gear. Vector had made bold claims about the vehicle's ability, specifically its top speed, claiming it could do around 230 miles an hour in 1979. Top Gear were naturally inclined to doubt this and sought to test it themselves, only to find Jerry Wiegert ordering them not to. Digressing from the story just briefly, the W2 was a fantastically futuristic supercar. Very unique and, in my opinion, extremely cool. Sadly, this visionary vehicle wasn't enough to maintain Vector's momentum, and development stalled out. A decade later, in 1989, Wiegert and Vector staged a return. Now called the Vector Aeromotive Corporation, not that they weren't previously a corporation, though it does certainly sound more official, they began production of the W8, an evolution of the W2, and the result of a decade of hard graft. Though not all of that decade was spent working on the car. See, money is always a problem for companies like Vector. Nobody really likes to invest in them because they're risky, and Jerry Wiegert was certainly not made of money. So, where did it come from? Well, funding sources were diverse, including public stock offerings as well as lawsuits aimed at Goodyear for their Vector tyre brand and Vantage cigarettes for reasons I may never know. Nevertheless, this creative form of financial backing proved enough to manufacture 2 W8 prototypes, of which one was actually a running car. The W8 was certainly an all-American supercar, with aggressive space-age looking bodywork made from aerospace materials, assembled around an aluminium composite monocoque chassis, and powered by a 6-litre, twin-turbocharged small-block V8. The engine produced a mammoth 730 brake horsepower, on high-octane fuel, and could propel the W8 to 60 miles an hour in 3.5 seconds, and up to a purported top speed of around 220 miles per hour. In 1991, Car and Driver magazine were testing the W8, or rather trying to, when all 3 of the press cars provided broke down or otherwise refused to work for whatever reason. This elicited very little sympathy from the outlet, who promptly branded Vector vaporware, though perhaps not being able to drive the W8 was a blessing in disguise. See, while the engine spawned Vector's bold claims, the car underneath was already getting on a bit, sporting a less than highly publicised 3-speed General Motors borrowed automatic transmission, completely archaic when compared to its European counterparts. The W8 became Vector's first production vehicle, with 17 being manufactured and sold to the public between 1989 and 1992. In 1993, after the resounding success, if you consider 17 sales a resounding success, of the Vector W8, Wiegert knew it was time for yet another car. He secured a spot at the 1993 Geneva Motor Show, where he displayed the Avtec WX3 Coupe and the Avtec WX3R Roadster. Both variants of the WX3 were set to have 3 different engine options: a 600 horsepower V8, an 800 horsepower tuned V8, or a monstrous 1200 horsepower twin turbocharged V8. That's all well and good, but you may be asking, what's Avtec? And it's a very good question. If you were to Google Avtec today, you would find it's the name of a Taiwanese surveillance solutions company. However, not only is that rather left field, it also didn't exist until 3 years after Wiegert displayed his Avtec WX3. To be clear, there is no sign I can find at least of a company name change. As far as I know, the company was still called Vector Aeromotive Corporation at this time, though perhaps his intent was to change it later on. He never got that chance. When the WX3 debuted in 1993, an Indonesian company called Megatech acquired a controlling stake in Vector Aeromotive. Upon returning from Geneva, the new owners wasted no time in actioning a coup. Vector's board asked that Wiegert resign as CEO and remain at the company simply as the designer. Unsurprisingly for a man who had worked by this point for over 2 decades building this company, Wiegert reacted poorly to this, refusing the offer and ordering that the company headquarters be physically locked down. Shortly after this event, he was formally fired by Vector Aeromotive. Luckily for Wiegert, he was a man who did not choose to keep all his eggs in one basket. Taking advantage of his access, he took possession of the WX3 Coupe and Roadster, painting them blue and purple respectively and using them to advertise his other venture, a jet ski company called Aquajet. What a legend! This guy gets sacked from his own company, and instead of moping or slowing down, he fucks off with 2 cars and starts flogging jet skis. Sigma behaviour. Back at Vector, Megatech wasted no time in trying to capitalise on their new brand. They moved Vector headquarters from the Uyghur-owned building in California to Green Cove Springs, Florida, where another one of Megatech's brands were already living. Enter Lamborghini. Yeah, for a brief moment in history, a state-backed, Bermuda-registered generic shell company owned Lamborghini, and now Vector too. The company worked closely with Lamborghini under the Megatech umbrella. The M12, while loosely based on the WX3 displayed at Geneva, was fitted with a Lamborghini V12 borrowed from the Diablo. This was a betrayal of Vector's whole purpose for being. No all-American supercar worth more than its weight in Big Macs should be powered by a foreign engine. To the surprise of nobody, Vector's new corporate overlords were not particularly interested in the vision of the man they'd just sacked, and pushed the M12 into production in 1995. The car was produced in Florida and introduced to the public at the 1996 North American International Auto Show, in the home of the American automobile, Detroit. Priced at $189,000, around $340,000 today. At the time, everyone's favourite motor journalist, farmer and part-time racist Jeremy Clarkson reviewed the M12 for Old Top Gear, ending the segment in a, let's say, uncomplimentary way. Megatech were disappointed at the lackluster sales and stopped production of the M12 in the same year. The following year, Megatech sold Lamborghini to Audi, and the remains of Vector was sold to Megatech management. Let's talk briefly about Megatech management. It's no secret that running a performance car brand profitably can be difficult. Cough cough TVR. However, many believed at the time that something more fishy was afoot at Megatech. Lo and behold, allegations of financial misconduct began to spring up. See, the principal of Megatech was a guy by the name of Tommy Suharto, and he allegedly illegally embezzled some money from the company to pad out his own bank account. Conveniently, however, he was the son of Indonesian dictator and international strongman General Suharto. Another quick tangential story, Tommy Suharto surprisingly actually faced consequences for his corruption, before commissioning the murder of the judge who convicted him. This landed him a murder conviction in 2002, for which he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, though he was released after less than 4, and today is wrestling for control of the Indonesian Burqa Raya Party, a fairly unpopular far-right party, at least according to Wikipedia. By early 1999, only 14 Vector M12s had been produced, and Lamborghini was failing to deliver the engines contracted with Vector, citing Vector's inability to pay. Allegedly, Lamborghini accepted a Vector W8 as payment for the engines. However, it turns out that W8 wasn't actually Vector's to give away, still technically belonging to Uyghur. Uyghur sued Lamborghini and their parent Volkswagen for the car, and won, though the car was supposedly never actually returned. There was value yet in the Vector brand though, or so its owners believed. They cut costs associated with the M12 and plumbed the car back into its American roots, replacing the Lamborghini V12 with a Corvette V8. They called the new car the SR V8. Sadly, however, the comeback would be short-lived, as within days of unveiling the first prototype of the SR V8, Vector shut its doors again. Only one single prototype was ever built. Following the closure of Vector Aeromotive, it was sold to American Aeromotive, from which Jerry Wiegut bought back Vector's assets, renaming the company first to Vector Supercars and then finally to Vector Motors. Rumours circulated that they were working on a new car. Indeed, in 2008, Vector presented a prototype WX8 at the LA Auto Show. The car was supposedly powered by a 10-litre aluminium V8 with an estimated output of 1,850 brake horsepower, more than the Bugatti Veyron and the SSC Ultimate Aero TT, which were the cars competing for the fastest production car at the time. With great power comes great speed. Vector claimed the WX would have a top speed of 275 miles an hour. Sadly, the car remained in development until Jerry Wiegert sadly passed away in early 2021. The WX8 prototype reportedly still sits on his driveway. So, just to recap, visionary car designer Jerry Wiegert decided in 1971 to make a car that looks like a jet fighter. And 50 years, 6 name changes, a hostile takeover, innumerable lawsuits, a dictator's son, a Lamborghini partnership, and a murder later, a grand total of 31 production cars and a handful of prototypes are what's left to show for it. But what absolutely fantastic cars they are! The W8 may well be, as Doug DeMuro once said, the single craziest car in the history of cars. And there's no higher praise. As I'm sure you can tell if you've watched this channel before, I myself am a fan of the more unorthodox offerings in the automotive world, and I doubt there has ever been anything less orthodox brought to market than Vector, specifically the W8. Its existence is ridiculous by any standard, and the world is certainly a better place for it. So, there you have it folks, the story of one of the wildest supercar manufacturers ever. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe and like the video for more content like this. If you have any thoughts or stories relating to today's topic, or any future video suggestions, comment them below, I read them all. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, goodbye.